Okay, you made a web app using Blazor WebAssembly. Now you need to make sure only the right people can access it. Dealing with user identity and access can be a challenge. In today's video, I will show you how to protect your Blazor app using Azure Active Directory. Let's get into it. Alright, first thing first, let's create a new project in Visual Studio. I'm going to select the Blazor WebAssembly empty template. I name it Blazor AD. I click on the next button and then I hit the create button to generate the project. Now that the project is created, let's add a configuration file to store settings from Azure AD. In the public folder, which is www.root, I add a new item. I search for app settings and add it to the folder. Inside this file, I will add a section called Azure AD. The first settings is authority, which specifies the URL for the Azure AD authority. It typically looks something like https://login.microsoftonline.com/tenant ID. We will replace the tenant ID later. The second setting is client ID, which represents the unique identifier for our Blazor app in Azure AD. We'll get this value when you register our app in Azure. Lastly, I will set the validate authority settings to true. This makes sure that the authority URL we specified earlier is validating during the authentication process. Now, in order to get this information, we need to register the application with Azure AD. I will head over to the Azure portal and look for the Azure Active Directory service. Inside, I will find the app registrations option in the menu. This is where I will register my Blazor app. I click on New Registration to start the registration process. For the name, I name it Blazor AD. You can name it whatever you want. Now I need to provide the redirect URL. Azure AD will use it to send the user after they've successfully authenticated. For the platform, it should be single page application, and the URL is https://localhost: the port, which is 5001, then /authentication and /login-callback. This URL will match a root in the development environment. If you have an app deployed to a server, you should use a different URL. So I hit the register button to complete the registration process, and that's it for the registration. So in the overview section, I'm going to copy some information for the app setting file. I will need the application ID and the directory ID. Now let's take a look at creating a group. I go back to the Azure Active Directory tenant. I select groups from the menu. I click on the new group to start the group creation process. I leave the group type to security. And I give super users as the name. I skip the description and click on the create button to create the group. You might need a few refreshes before seeing the group. Once the group is created, click on it to see the detail, and I will copy the object ID. We will need it later for configuring group policies in the app. So now we need to configure the app registration to receive information about the groups. For that, let's find out our app registration again. So inside the app registration menu, I will look for token configuration section. So this is where we can configure the claims our app receives. So we need to enable the groups claim. I will click on the add group claim, and next I will check the security groups checkbox and click on the add button. Now let's go back to the Azure AD for creating some users. In the menu, I select users. Next, I select new user, and then click on the create new user. So let's call him John. I will copy the username and the generated password. And let's click on Review plus Create to create the user. Again, you might need to refresh the page a few times before the user is displayed. Next, I'm going to create a new user. Let's call him Mike. I also copy the username and the password. In the Assignment tab, I click on the Add Group so I can add the user to the group I created earlier. So I click on the Review plus Create to create the user. Now that we have registered our app in Azure AD and created the required group, it's time to update our app settings. So we need to replace the tenant ID with the actual Azure AD tenant identifier we obtained during app registration. We will also need to replace the client ID. And remember the group we created in Azure AD? Let's add a section for groups. And I add superuser's ID entry and set its value to the ID of the group in Azure AD. Now let's add some NuGet packages that will give our app the necessary functionality to implement authentication and authorization. I will use the Package Manager console, but feel free to use the NuGet Package Manager user interface. So I start with Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authorization. Next, I will install the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Component.Authorization. And finally, I will install the package Microsoft.Authentication.WebAssembly.msal. So to make these functionalities available in the whole app, I will import some namespaces in the import file. So let's start with the authorization, then components.authorization, and then component.webassembly.authentication. Now that we have the necessary NuGet packages, it's time to enable authentication. First, we'll need to add a script reference to the index.html file in the public folder. So this script is provided by the Microsoft.Authentication.WebAssembly.msal package and handles the authentication functionality. So next, we set up authentication using MSAL service for our app. So in the program.cs file, on the services collection, I will use the extension method add MSAL authentication. So we need to configure the authentication options to ensure our app integrates with Azure AD correctly. So I will use the bind method to bind the Azure AD section from the app settings file to the authentication options. So I will set the login mode property to redirect. This means our app will redirect users to the Azure AD login page instead of a pop-up for authentication. So we need to make a small adjustment in our app.razor file. It has a router component, so this component handles the routing within our application. To make sure that the authentication state is spread across our app, we will wrap the router component with the cascading authentication state component. So this change ensures that the authentication state is available to all the components within our app. So in addition, we will swap out the route view component with authorize view route component. This component guarantees that only users who are authenticated can access the route. So to handle cases where users are not authorized to access a specific resource, we will add the not authorized component inside the authorize route view. So if the user is not authenticated, we will send him to the authentication/login route. So otherwise, we display a message that says he cannot access the page. The authentication component doesn't exist yet, so let's create it. So in the pages folder, I add a new component. I call it authentication.razor. So in the component, I will set the root attribute to /authentication/action. So this sets the root for the component to handle various authentication actions. So let's add a parameter that will hold the action. So to handle the authentication process, we will use the remote authenticator view component. Its action property is set to the action parameter. So this section set up the remote authenticator view component and allows us to specify the action dynamically based on the root. Nice. So let's update the message in the index component. And let's also add the authorize attribute. So this attribute makes sure that only authenticated users can access the index page. Let's also add an admin component. So we can access it through the root/admin. And we also add the authorize attribute to restrict access. And let's also add a welcoming message. So to enhance the user experience and provide navigation option based on authentication status, let's update the main layout component. So let's include the authorize view component, which lets us display content based on whether the user is authenticated or not. So inside the authorize component, I add a button that allows user to log out. The click handler uses the navigate to logout method from the navigation manager to redirect to the authentication page with the logout action. And the second parameter indicates the route where we want to be redirected after the logout. In this case, it's the home page. And just below, I display a welcome message with the user's name. So next, I add a navigation menu to include links to the home and admin pages. Excellent. The moment we have been waiting for has arrived, so we can test our app. If I run the app, you can see that I am redirected to the login page. So I will log in with the first user we created, which is John. So because it is the first time I logged in, the system invites me to update my password. Now I can click on the sign in button. Looks like I have an error. Sorry, but we're having trouble signing you. This might be a configuration issue. So first we should take a peek at the app settings file. Interesting. So the client ID is incorrect. I accidentally used the tenant ID instead. So let me fix this. Okay, so let's give it another shot now. So I try login again, and this time it should work. All I need to do now is to click on the accept. There we go, we logged in now. So take a look at the screen and you will notice the logout button. And right below, you will see the name John displayed as the currently logged in user. Now let's make things interesting. We configure a super user group in Azure AD. Let's update the hub so we can authorize based on the group. In the program.cs file, on the services collection, I call the extension method add authorization core. In the action delegate, I had a new policy named superusers. So the policy requires users to have a specific group claim. I get the value from the configuration, use the key groups superusers ID as defined in the app settings. We are going to ensure that only users from the superusers group have access to the admin page. So in the admin component, in the authorize attribute, I specify the policy we register in the program.cs. So let's give it another go. So we'll start with a user who isn't part of the superusers group. So if he attempts to access the admin page, you can see that the access is denied. So let's log out for now. Let's try with the user who actually belongs to the superusers group. Okay, since it's the first time I use this user, I need to update the password again. And now I can go ahead and accept the permissions. Okay, once in, take a look at the screen. You will notice that the name displayed is Mike. Let's attempt to access the admin page. Because Mike is part of the superusers group, is granted special access to the admin page. And that was it for today's video. I will put the link for the source code in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.